Good morning, guys. Today we're going to start our lecture for vertebrate anatomy, and we are going to do the first lecture, Lecture 1, which goes over a lot of Chapter 1 and then some other conceptual things that we're going to use both in lecture and in lab. So the first thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about what is comparative anatomy, because you may have had an anatomy before, either in high school or at UIndy. In comparative anatomy, what it does is it compares structures within an organism or between organisms, right? And we're going to focus on vertebrates, because this is vertebrate anatomy. And we're going to look at, for example, limbs and different vertebrates and see how they're shaped. And what we'll come to find is you'll see, based on evolution, that limbs have the same bones, but those bones are shaped a little differently to fit environments, right? Or fit what we call niches. And that's kind of what a comparative anatomy allows us to do. So this first photo here, this is Archaeopteryx. This is one of those intermediate fossils that show dinosaurs with feathers. So you can see here, if you're following my pointer on the left, we have some feathers here that are coming off of or radiating off of the skeleton here of Archaeopteryx. This is kind of a drawing of what Archaeopteryx might have looked like. The colors and renditions are the artist's choice. Archaeopteryx lived about 147 million years ago. And so what this figure shows us immediately is that feathers arose before flight happened. And Archaeopteryx is a type of velociraptor. Velociraptors are a type of dinosaur that Jurassic Park made famous, right? And all velociraptors had feathers, unlike what you see in Jurassic Park. So comparative anatomy is really important because anatomists are kind of the first biologists, if you will, that jumped on Darwin's bandwagon when Darwin introduced us to the origin of species, right? And what natural selection was. Because it started to make a lot of sense that anatomists could look at different skeletons of vertebrates and go, yeah, that is exactly what happened. We have the same bones, and those bones are molded to fit the environment that the animal lives in. And this explanation, this hypothesis that Darwin proposed, is a really good explanation for the variation that we see in morphology across taxa. So, deals with the anatomy and morphology and compares structures among animals. Anatomy and morphology are different. Anatomy is simply structure. Morphology is typically structure plus something. Comparative morphology is when you're using the anatomy of two organisms and you're comparing to see how they're similar or different. So what comparative anatomy allows us to do is define structures and compare them among vertebrates. It helps us understand maybe evolutionary change or how animals are related to each other ancestrally. Also, very important with comparative anatomy is this form equals function. That is, understanding what bones look like and why they look the way they do allows an animal to function a certain way. Internal structures within the body look a certain way because they perform function. So anatomy and physiology are intimately related, as many of you have already been told. It is a major thing for me as a histologist. I'm a very visual person. I love anatomy. Anatomy often dictates what that structure can do within the organism. So here's an example of this. So you can look at dolphins, for example, and sharks, and they all have fins. On the external aspects, those fins look very similar, and one might say, hey, those two animals are related to each other because of similarity. But as you know, or may know, dolphins are not fish, sharks are. And it's the environment that has shaped these structures to look alike. And often the environment can do that in groups of animals that are not closely related to each other. We'll talk about many forms of it. And it's called convergent evolution or homoplasy, right, which I have a slide on later on. Homoplasy is when structures look alike but don't share common ancestry. Homo meaning same, plasy means structure, right? And we'll talk about what convergent evolution is because it's really important for us to understand convergent evolution along with real, what we call evolutionary change, so we can understand how animals have adapted over time. Also, if you note, there's a major difference between the tail, all right, morphology, when you look at dolphins and other fish, and with sharks. And that's what this next slide shows. We have two fish here. We have a bony fish on top of gar, and we have a shark on the bottom. And the one thing you notice is they both have fins, right? But the homocircular tail in the bony fish looks different than the heterocircular tail in sharks. Homo, the phrase homo here means same, right? And hetero means different. And those are referring to the circular part, the actual lobe. So notice the two lobes. We're going to call this the dorsal or the lobe of the back, and the ventral or the lobe on the belly side are the same size and shape, whereas in the shark, the dorsal lobe is much taller. And when you start to look at this, you wonder why, right? The question might be, if you're a curious biologist, is why are their tails different? And you start to explore then, what are the major differences between fish and sharks? And bony fish have swim bladders. So they have a little air sac in their bellies that they can fill up and deflate that allows them to maintain perfect neutral buoyancy, so they can just kind of hover in the water with no effort. Sharks, on the other hand, lack that swim bladder. And if they stop swimming, they sink to the bottom. And what a heterocircular tail does is produce lift. And it makes it easier for sharks to maintain their depth without that swim bladder. Whereas bony fish have a bladder for maintaining depth, and therefore they don't need this extra lobe. They have a homocircular tail, which allows them to swim forward, swim backward, turn better. It makes them more agile in their environment, if you will. So here's some nice pictures up here. So we got over here a parrotfish that has a nice homocircular tail, as you can see, and then a whale shark that has a really tall dorsal lobe to its tail and has a heterocircular tail. So again, comparative anatomy and evolution, they fit real nicely together. And as I mentioned, this is why comparative anatomists were the first to hop on Darwin's bandwagon and really say, hey, evolution is a real thing. It helps us explain why these skeletons look different from one another. And here's a really great example down here. These are limbs within a group of vertebrates that are called amniotes. All right. So amniotes are vertebrates, tetrapods. Tetrapod meaning they walk on land, that all produce their offspring and surround them with an extra embryonic membrane that we call the amnion, right? We belong to this group, obviously. So you have humans here, you have the cat, whale, and bat. And the one thing you know is these four animals occupy really different environments. We know that, right? If you look at their limbs, this is the forearms, they all have the same bones, and those bones are color coordinated here in this image. But the bones are shaped radically different to fit the environment that they live in. And so evolution shapes structures inherited from a line of evolution, from a line of ancestry, if you will, from a familial line that's evolutionarily linked. All right, so all of these animals share a common ancestor a long time ago, and therefore that's where they got the sequence of bones that you see in the forearm. But over time, the bones have been shaped by the environment, by something we're going to call natural selection, that allows these animals to fit their niche, if you will, perfectly. Bats have beautiful limb bones. You can even see them if you flash them with light. You can see the long finger bones, and you can see the humerus and the radius and the ulna here very nicely in that image. So much evidence for evolution can be found by simply comparing differences and similarities in structure and morphology. Limbs are a great example of this. Structure are often shaped by evolution, by the environment over millions and millions of years. And they're slowly selected for and changed over time. And with bones, another beautiful thing about bones is they show up in the fossil record. And so, people who study bones, geologists and some of the other biologists that study bones from extinct forms also see these differences, and even can see some of the changes that happened back in time that led to what we see in the living species today. And so that's really nice for evolution and something we call macroevolution that we'll kind of explain later in this lecture. So comparative anatomy is central to evolution. All right, so what we're going to do is discuss evolution a little bit. I know we've done that. You've done this in 155. And I just want to go over it really quickly so we kind of understand it, because we're going to use evolutionary themes throughout the class. We're going to use a lot of what we call phylogenetic trees. I'm also going to go into some taxonomy, and I want to kind of compare the differences between evolution and taxonomy. So I love these cartoons here, right? God playing as a child, producing a chicken, right? Making some mistakes, which God doesn't do, right? And this is lemurs here. This one's evolved because as they run in and commit this suicide that we don't understand as far as the way they work, this one is evolved because it has an inner tube, right? So they're kind of funny cartoons. But let's talk about evolution. All right, so I put this picture up with a bunch of different types of organisms. We have a vertebrates, we have an alga here, we have some algae, we have an amoeba in the middle, we have a bromeliad and a fungus. And so we see all of this diversity. Not only is there major differences here, but there are lots of different fungi, and there are lots of different protists, and there are lots of different mammals. Where does all this diversity come from, and how did it come to be on this planet, right? And that's where evolution is central to biologists who have been asking these questions since the time of Darwin, or before Darwin. So this variation, as we know, came about because of evolutionary change, all right? And all evolution is, if you keep it really simple, is change in phenotype or genotype over time. And if you watch a population over time, it's going to change from generation to generation, which alleles are there and which are not there. All right, so evolutionary change is the consequence of changes in allele frequency. This is the genetic definition of evolution. It's not the one that you always see in a textbook, right? And this is kind of the genetic definition, which is between Mendel and Darwin's theories. Mendel and Darwin, even though Mendel tried to communicate with Darwin, Darwin really didn't believe what Mendel did. And it wasn't until later on when biologists connected the two together. Because change in allele frequency changes phenotype, right? And that's what we're going to assume. New alleles can change the genotype and therefore change the phenotype of the organism. Evolution works on phenotype, on what you look like, right? What the structure is. But all structure is ultimately programmed or determined by the code, right? By the genetic code. So evolutionary change has happened from our single-celled ancestors 1 billion years ago all the way up to what you see today. And it's simply a change in allele frequencies over a very long period of time. So let's kind of talk about how evolution works, right? Now, there are two types of evolution. There's microevolution, and then there's what we call macroevolution, right? So we got micro versus macroevolution. All right, so what's the differences? Microevolution happens at the population level, at the species level, and no higher. And we'll talk about what that means in a minute. All right, so a population of individuals changes over time. That's microevolution. Macroevolution is when species give rise to new species or replace species. Some species go extinct, new species arise from older species. And that is what macroevolution is. So microevolution is much easier to prove, if you will, or to support, right? We don't really prove things in science, and particularly biology. But microbiology we can see because it happens within a time frame that we can see during our lifetime, right? Macroevolution is on a larger scale, right? It involves many species and often involves the environment and even ecological change, changes at much larger levels of biology, which take a lot longer time. They might take hundreds of thousands or even millions of years to see. And a lot of times macroevolution is supported really nicely by the fossil record or by looking at genetic codes, right? Microevolution leads to macroevolution. Lots and lots and lots of microevolution over long periods of time lead to new species, either adapting to environments or going extinct because they don't have enough adaptations, if you will, to the changing environment. Now, what we need to understand is that populations evolve, not individuals. Individuals are fixed. When they're born, their genotype is fixed. They can't change it, right? Populations can evolve because there's variation in what each individual looks like. That is, there's not one individual that's all the same. Individuals look different. Just look at the people in a classroom that you're sitting in. Some have red hair, some have brown hair, some have black hair, some have blonde hair. Some people have no hair, right? There's a whole bunch of difference in what you see phenotypically. There's lots of variation in the individuals within a population. So a population of individuals is the smallest unit of evolutionary change. It's the smallest unit that can undergo evolutionary change. And that change happens over time. So unlike individuals, populations are permitted to basically accumulate, populations can, changes in alleles, which are called, we call mutations, for example. So individuals don't evolve, populations and species do. So we're going to define the difference between a population and a species in a minute. The total number of genes and their differences in alleles, right, and what they look like, is called the gene pool, is what you learned, right? So if you got a bunch of different types of alleles or genotypes within the population, then you have a gene pool that evolution can work on. Evolution can only work on variable populations that have lots of variation within them. If a population all looks alike or all the same genotype, evolution doesn't happen. That population becomes what we call fixed. So microevolution is the change in relative frequencies of alleles in a gene pool, right, which is part of a population or a species. So what's the difference between a population and a species? It's pretty simple. A population, if I draw it in blue, is a group of individuals that are occupying space that can interbreed, right? So that's what a population is. So a population of individuals that are kind of found in a particular place, and they can mingle and move within the environment, and when they find each other, they can breed and produce offspring. A species is a group of reproductively isolated subpopulations. So you might have several populations kind of next to each other that are all the same type of individual, and these are subpopulations collectively are called a species, right? And the species concept is very arbitrary. It's very human, right? And there are 34, 35, I think there are even close to 40 different definitions of what a species is, which is very confusing. We're going to use biological species in this class to describe what a species is. And a species that's biological, as you'll see in a slide or two, is a species that can interbreed. If two individuals come together and can't interbreed, then they're not the same species. If they can come together and interbreed, then they are the same species. So a species is a group of isolated reproductive populations. They can't interbreed. That means they can move around in many cases, right? And that's called migration, and they can move from population to population. And because of that, all these individuals will be able to interbreed because they're exchanging their gene pools, right? So that's what a species is a group of populations that are around each other that may be isolated from other species populations in other places, and they reproduce with one another and produce fertile offspring. So here is a population of garter snakes. And there might be a population here in this particular acre of woods, and then down the road, another acre, there might be another population, and then down the road about 3 miles might be another population, and those populations make up the species of what we call, this is the eastern garter snake, right? Then they're all eastern garter snakes. So populations and species can evolve, right? Because there's some variation in what each of those snakes look like. So how do we change allele frequencies over time? You've seen this slide before also. Basically, there are 4 major ways to do this that you learned in Biology 155. There's mutation, which is how alleles change over time within a population. It's random and slow, but it happens. And the Earth is old, right? Now we know that it's old now. And there's been plenty of time for mutation to arise and accumulate within the individuals of populations and species. There are a couple other ways we can do this. There's genetic drift and gene flow. And these really can radically change which alleles are there. Genetic drift is random change in allele frequency, and it can happen in a couple different ways, but here are 2 of the major ways: bottleneck and founder effect. So for example, if you got a population of beetles and there's some red and green ones, and a rock falls and kills all the green ones and you're left with red, you've just bottlenecked the population and removed alleles, right? And now over time, only red ones are alive, and so that those red ones arose from a bottleneck. A founder effect is when, let's say, red and yellow beetles are found in a population, and some of the yellow ones leave and form a new population far away, and they've removed some of the alleles from the original population, right? And now you only have yellow beetles in that other population. That is what's called founder effect. And it's just random changes that happen in allele frequencies in populations. Gene flow is a change in gene pool due to movement. So you might have distant populations, and if they're birds, for example, that are maybe the same species, that have some different genes over here than the population that's found 3 or 4 miles away, and one flies over and brings in those new genes, that would be gene flow, and we call that migration. Gene flow between populations keeps the populations really similar, right? And therefore the same species. What that means is that really it's kind of the counter to evolution, right? If you can't reproductively isolate populations so they can become different from one another, then there is migration and gene flow, then they're going to stay the same species. Natural selection is the major one that you talk about when you talk about Darwin, right? When you talk about evolution. It leads to differential reproductive success in groups that accumulate adaptations to the environment. And they are better successful at reaching reproductive age and then actually reproducing. And it's the only directional type of evolution. It moves in a direction. That's what selection does. So selection is the differential survival of individuals with certain traits and phenotypes. Selection acts on phenotypes. We call these selection pressures or environmental pressures. And because in part phenotypes are part of a population and there's some variation in what phenotypes you see, the environment or a selection pressure like a certain predator might put pressure on certain phenotypes and not others, and therefore remove those phenotypes from a population. And over time, that phenotype might disappear and another one might become more common. Change in allele frequency and phenotype over time. And it's moving directionally towards one of the phenotypes. That is natural selection, right? So this particular beautiful bat down here looks like a bat. We know it's a bat. It has an elongated snout where some of the bones of the face have been changed. So it has a longer tongue so it can reach the nectar in these flowers. And has evolved over time to nectar on certain flowers that bats become major pollinators of. So that's an example. So this leads to adaptation and reproductive success. So the accumulation of traits that are selected for leads to adaptations in the population, the increase in certain phenotypes and the decrease in others, which leads to reproductive success in some phenotypes and not others. This is the only agent of evolution, as I mentioned, that's directional, right? It moves in a direction, a certain phenotypic direction. And Darwinian fitness is defined as an individual's contribution to the gene pool. That is, if you are fit, you have good Darwinian fitness, you are passing your genes on to the next generation very frequently. If you have really poor Darwinian fitness and you're not passing your genes on at all to the next generation, and then those individuals might pass your genes on further and further and further, and your fitness gets stronger and stronger and stronger if you're continually passing these genes through generations. So production of fertile offspring is the only real measure, if you will, that selection is successful. This is a Darwinian finch here. And this particular finch has a large, strong beak, and it can crush these fruits that have really large seeds that have a heavy seed coat. And it's the only real finch that can do that. It can take advantage of a food source no other finch can, and therefore has great reproductive success and great fitness within certain Galapagos Islands because it's able to take advantage of food sources. Really, selection is pretty intuitive once you start thinking about it. And evolution is pretty intuitive once you start thinking about it. So I don't know if you can see here, this is a moth. The moth's in the middle, and it is camouflaged very nicely here. Those color patterns and the color of the moth were selected over time and allows them to hide from predators, right? Which would give them reproductive success and allow them to breed, while a white moth would stick out like a sore thumb here, right? When birds would pick them off. So the selection pressure is predation, and camouflage allows these moths to survive. So adaptation is an inherited trait that increases an organism's chance to survive and reproduce. There are a couple different types of adaptations here. There are structural adaptations, changes in what you look like, what your color is, what your physical characters are. There are behavioral characteristics. As long as this moth sits still, right? When a predator's around, behaviorally, it won't get eaten. If it moves, the bird can see it, right? Functional or your internal body systems. Your biochemistry has changed. You might have, for example, some muscle tissue types, red and white muscle, that allow you to produce bursts of speed to get to a prey better or escape a predator better. And that biochemistry change in certain individuals within the population internally or functionally allow them to reproduce better. So again, here is a primate here that has really large eyes. That's nocturnal. That takes advantage of the night, using and gathering light with its large eyes. And here is that example I gave you functionally, where you have fish that have red and white muscle types, the white being really fast twitch muscle, the red being more used for migratory purposes or for long distance swimming The fish that have both have reproductive success versus those that don't. So these are all examples of kind of adaptations that can arise directionally within populations. Mimicry and adaptation. Mimicry and camouflage are also major adaptations. So the difference between the two is camouflage enables a species to blend into an environment. Mimicry mimics a species that's dangerous. So here's an example of a beautiful butterfly. When it closes its wings, it looks a lot like the leaf litter. So it's this is an example of camouflage. Mimicry would be like this, right? Where you have a predator, an owl, and the eye spots on the back of a moth that would show those, right, to a potential predator, and the predator will run away because they think it's an owl and not a moth. Down here we have, again, nice camouflage. These are stick bugs. This stick bug down here, it's a stick bug. These bugs down here, this insect looks a lot like the thorns that are found on this plant, and they blend in really well, so that would be camouflage. All right, so let's talk about Darwin a little bit. So Darwin is the person, and you guys have talked about him previously, so I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. So Charles Darwin, he synthesized this theory of evolution. It's now called a theory because it's been tested over and over and over and over again, thousands of publications on evolution. So his original hypothesis is now considered and stood the test of time and is a theory, is about as real as you can get, right? As close to truth as you can get. Whereas a hypothesis is an educated guess that you test and you can refute it, right? Refute it and then change it. Evolution is a core theme in biology. It's hard to study biology without accepting and using evolution as your mechanism. And before Darwin started his voyage and started looking at organisms, he thought that species were fixed as a young man and the earth was very young. And we know, and you guys have already heard this probably before, that Darwin made long treks around the world, right? And at this time, in the late 1800s, mid 1800s, sorry, European countries were branching out because there were lots of natural resources found in something called the New World, right? And so they wanted to go out and gather those natural resources and bring riches back to their countries. And so Darwin participated in this as the naturalist on the Beagle, and the Beagle was exploring the ocean, trying to find ways to get around the ocean more quickly and transverse the planet faster. And everywhere that they stopped, his job was to take notes and collect species that he could bring back to England. And a lot of his time, or he spent lots of time on the South American coast and also some time right there in the middle there on the Galapagos Islands. And the Galapagos Islands really helped him shape his observations into a mechanism of how animals change over time. He also read a lot of other scientists out there that were doing work on this trip when you spend time on a boat, right? And he read several other scientific writings at the time that helped him mold and shape the way he thought evolution happened. And here are a couple people, for example, a couple scientists that are very important in Darwin's thought process. Lyell was a geologist. He read a lot and actually met. He argued that the land changed constantly and slowly. He's talking about planet Earth, plate tectonics, geology, that the planet has changed constantly over its 4.5 billion years. And he called this uniformitarianism. And this slow change Darwin really liked. And he thought about species changing slowly over time. The big problem was the Earth wasn't old enough to see all of the diversity he was seeing. So he thought the Earth must be much older than what the Bible says, right? Which was the major information on how old planet Earth was at the time in the 1800s. Was about 6,000 years old, right? We now know that it's much older than that. It's in the billions of years. Lamarck is also a biologist who is really known for his hypothesis on evolution that is wrong, right? Lamarckian evolution. But he did propose that organisms changed over time during their lifetime and they could pass that on to their offspring, which is not true. Our genotypes are fixed and the change has to happen from generation to generation. But Lamarck pushed and proposed, based on the fossil record, that organisms do change. And even though his hypothesis or mechanism was wrong, he helped Darwin shape a mechanism that supported more what we were observing within the natural world. All right, so what Darwin became convinced of as he did these travels was that the Earth was much older than what the Bible said, much older than what other scientists had said, and has continually changed over time. And so he found lots of different fossils. He found animals that were extinct that are alive on, at least animals that look similar to animals that are alive on different continents that were extinct. For example, we found skeletons of what looked like hippos in South America that obviously live in Africa now, right? He found marine seashells on tops of mountains. He found things where they shouldn't be. And what that tells him is that the Earth has changed, right? Those seashells that used to be underwater, and then those mountains pulled them up onto out of the water through geologic changes on the planet Earth. And obviously those particular species went extinct. So he concluded that living things kind of change in the same way. They change over time from generation to generation, or evolve over time. And he stated this, or called this, descent with modification. That is, if you follow a generation through time, it's going to eventually develop enough microevolutionary adaptations to change into new species. And organisms produce many more offspring than the environment can support. It's another conclusion that he made. And because of that, these offspring or organisms will compete for food sources, for example. And those that compete better than others are going to be successful in reproduction. Those that can't compete are going to die off, right? And so varying characteristics or variability in the morphological or phenotypic variation that you see in a population will lead to competition and adaptation based on natural selection. Whoops. And so here's some of the observations that Darwin made, and you've heard of these. These are kind of the islands of the Galapagos. And he noticed when he went from island to island that these giant tortoises that they had stopped to actually take onto boats that they use as food sources were very different from one another. They didn't all look alike in the islands. They were obviously giant tortoises, which means they all probably came from a common ancestor, but they all have been separated now by ocean over millions of years, and they look much different from island to island because each island has kind of its own suite of selection pressures or environments. And so dome tortoises here, which have a shell close to the neck so they can reach vegetation that's really close to the ground, are much different than the saddlebacks that are found way over here on Hispaniola, which have very large space on the dorsal part of their shell so they can reach food sources that are very high. And then there's an intermediate turtle between those where the vegetation is more nutritious at the intermediate heights. And so tortoises are shaped over time based on their food source, and that food source is shaped what their shell looks like over time, over millions of years. And so he sees these variations on different islands and sees the difference in the environments and starts to put together the environment is selecting for certain morphological phenotypes or certain forms, if you will, or morphologies, and selecting for them. One thing that really helped him mold this was Darwin was from a farming community, or he lived on a farming community as a boy, and farmers do this, right? They select the cows that produce the most milk in order to breed them, right? In order to get cows that produce even better milk supply, or those cows that have good meat are bred so that you produce generations that produce even more meat. And so that's called artificial selection. So he kind of applied that artificial selection he saw in farming communities to the environment. So the natural world is selecting for certain phenotypes that allow them to fit certain niches or environments. He also noticed, just like what they did with the tortoises, that most species have variation within them in their populations. And so these are just ladybugs. And you can see there's tremendous variation in what ladybugs look like. This variation is really important in phenotype because that's what selection works on, is phenotype, right? And this arises naturally because of sexual reproduction, because you're taking genes from mom and dad, and they come together, and then you're mixing them up, right, through independent assortment and whatnot, and through crossing over, and you can get all of these different allele variation in frequencies, and you get different variation in phenotypes. That's the importance of sex. It maintains variability, genetic variation, or genetic diversity, if you will, within a population that allows evolution to occur. So that mechanism of change, it looks like this. So Darwin observed the environment could select for features of variation. And the Darwin finches are a great example of this, and he talks about them a lot in The Origin of Species. This is kind of a phylogenetic tree of finches. He knows they're all finches, and what's really neat is the finches kind of look like the finch that you found on the mainland of South America. All right, so he knew there was some common ancestor, a South American common ancestor, and he thought they had to have been blown off course to reach the Galapagos Islands, which are far enough out to sea, right, that the birds probably won't fly back, and that there are several islands with different environments that are found in that archipelago, right, of islands. And what he noticed as he went from island to island, that they were all still finches. There was a little variation in size, but the real difference in the finches, as you can see here, is beak, right, what the beak looks like. And the beak has been shaped over time to basically take advantage of certain food sources. And this is island dependent. The beautiful thing about birds is they can fly, right? If they don't like what they find on one island, they fly to the next one. If they like the island and can take advantage of the food sources, then they stay there. There obviously was some variation in beak size among these finches that made it to the islands. And over time, if one of the larger finches with the larger beak landed on an island where there were fruit you could only crack with the big beak, they were the only ones that were going to stay there. Everybody else flies to the next island. And then in that population of birds that decided to stay, those with the largest and strongest beaks would reproduce more successfully because they could eat more of the fruit, and the larger beak would, over time, accumulate to a size that's quite large, right? And takes advantage of the food source that is there. And those are the birds that are breeding on that island. That's kind of how selection and evolution works. Creates new species from old species. Now, if you bring these large ground finches back to an island with, let's say, this gray warbler finch over here, which have been separated for millions of years on these islands, they now can't interbreed and are now two new species. So the accumulation of microevolutionary changes or adaptations in this bird versus this bird from the original populations led to two new species, right? Obviously, lots of species over the life history, if you will, of the Galapagos finch. And that's kind of how selection works and how evolution works. It's really intuitive, right? Now, what Darwin did is Darwin gave us a mechanism. That's what's important. Evolution isn't new to Darwin, right? He had Lamarck said organisms change over time. He kind of gave a mechanism that was wrong. Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Socrates, they said that species change over time, but it was more of a philosophical idea. They didn't give us really a mechanism. What Darwin gave us is a mechanism to work with that we can test. That's the importance of biology as a science, right? We have to be able to apply the scientific method to the mechanism and the questions that we ask. We have to produce hypotheses that can be tested. And that's what Darwin did. He proposed, for example, and allowed us to then kind of modify this to fit other scientific design. But he proposed three major conditions within the origin of species. He said and stated, species when left alone will produce high numbers. And it doesn't matter if they're really slow reproducers like elephants. If you leave them go over a long enough period of time, they're going to produce lots of elephants, right? They're going to end up being lots of elephants, lots of offspring. Populations produce more offspring than they need, no matter how fast or slow their reproduction is. Eventually, what this leads to are population booms, which consume large percentages of resources within certain parts of the world or environment. Until these resources become scarce, that leads to competition between the individuals within populations. And this causes struggle among those individuals within a population, and only those with superior adaptations will survive and pass their traits on to the next generations. Others will die off. So the environment is going to select for certain adaptations that allow them to feed better, reach reproductive success better, using our tortoise or our Darwin's finch example, and therefore reproduce. And that's what you're going to see are those phenotypes in the population. He called this natural selection. the environment or nature selecting for morphological differences or phenotypes, certain phenotypes. You also hear a lot survival of the fittest. That wasn't coined by Darwin. That was actually coined by Herbert Spencer, one of the comparative anatomists, one of the guys that were, one of the major scientists who supported Darwin during Darwin's lifetime. Alfred Wallace also came up with the same exact mechanism, as you guys know. Wallace did this within a different archipelago region in Indonesia, the Komodo Island archipelago, and saw Komodo dragons and other species. But the Komodo Islands are much the same. They have a number of species that look like species that are found in Asia, but they have changed a lot to fit the island habitats, and therefore are considered new species because they are reproductively isolated and look a lot different than the mainland species that you see. And he came up almost with kind of the exact mechanism, even though they never communicated with one another, which is really neat, right? Wallace put pressure on Darwin to publish, and Darwin published first, and therefore is immortalized, right, by this theory of what we call Darwinian evolution. So natural selection is a process by which populations of organisms with variation, some of them survive, some of them don't, and those that do survive are directionally survive because they reach reproductive age and can produce offspring with the same adaptation. So this variation in phenotypes that you see from generation to generation that are based on selection are examples of microevolution, right? And you got lots of different pictures out there or diagrams that show this. So our selection pressure here are predators, right? And you got different colored rodents. Obviously, the white ones stick out more than the brown ones, and over time, from generation to generation, you can see the brown ones are going to dominate, the white ones are going to be rare, right? Here's an owl coming down on a mouse. That's selection at work. A couple of other things that we can see when we start looking at organisms is the multiple definitions of what we call function, or the multiple definitions of morphology, if you will. So most structures are designed in the present day to fit particular niches, and selection pressures are those that were actually environmental pressures that led to the morphologies that we see today in our vertebrates. There are a couple different definitions here. The function of a structure is the property of the part that allows it to work in the organism. So, for example, wings are shaped so that birds can fly, right? Flight is really important to birds' survival, right? Or its biological role, because it allows them to utilize the environment more efficiently. If a bird wants to escape a ground predator, it flies away, right? If the environment is not suitable for the bird flies south, right? The wing itself and the shape of the wing is what allows flight. Flight allows the bird to adapt more readily to its environment. Flight is a huge adaptation. Animals that can fly are the most successful group of animals in those groups. So birds are one of the most successful tetrapod because they can fly. They have the largest number of species. Insects that fly are really abundant, right? Organisms, because they can fly around. They can move from environment to environment. So function is the property of the part that allows it to work, and the biological role is how that structure, the wing, for example, allows the organism to survive in the environment. Feathers, for example, arose as pre-adaptations, right? What I mean by that is evolution doesn't just produce things out of nowhere, right? It's not like poof, and there are feathers. Feathers arose not for flight, they arose from some other reason. And all a feather is a modified scale. It's really all it is. It's a modified scale in reptiles. Birds are reptiles. And so the scale changes a little bit. The genetics that control the feather production have changed a little bit, mutated over time. Their genetic code is a little different than a normal scale, and you get feathers, all right? And feathers probably arose and were maintained in populations for two major reasons, they think, for thermoregulation and for courtship. And you see feathers arise in the velociraptors when Pangea was actually separating, right? So the continents were separating into the continents we know today. That is the big Pangean mass of continents that were actually starting to separate. And a lot of these were starting to move north and south, and the environment started changing, started cooling down on these continents. And feathers arose about that time, right? You see feathers arising about that time of separation in northern and southern regions of what would have been the separation of those continents from Pangaea at this time. And that these feathers probably allowed, like we see with birds today, to maintain their body temperature a little more effectively. Or they might be arose for recognition, which you still see with sexual selection in a lot of birds, showing that they're male and female. And so they could recognition, courtship, and once the feather arose and was selected for these adaptations to the environment, thermoregulation and courtship, it's now a pre-adaptation for flight. Once the feather's there, then we can work on the feather and change it into contour feathers over time that might be involved in gliding or escaping predators more efficiently until we rose to flight. There are obviously a suite of other adaptations that happen to birds that allow them to fly successfully. Lightening of bones, removal of organs, increase in heart and flight muscle size and whatnot, changes to the lungs. All of these suite of adaptations happen together. And it took long periods of time for them to arise. So that's what pre-adaptation is a structure that you see today, right? Didn't necessarily arise for what you see. So feathers we see in flight, but the original reason that they were selected for is probably not for flight. It was some pre-adaptation or something else like thermoregulation and courtship, which allows for pre-adaptation of flight or eventually the development of flight. So evolution happens in steps, right? In a sequence of steps that you can often trace in the fossil record. So if I go back to Archaeopteryx, remember the first slide I showed you? That dinosaur couldn't fly. It was too heavy. So why were the feathers there, right? That's the big question. Thermoregulation, courtship, or recognition are probably the answers. All right, that's where I'm going to stop today. All right, I'm going to start up a second lecture on morphology and morphological concepts. So I think we can stop there with that part of Darwin and evolution. Have a great day.